The only sound in the room was the slight hum of the air conditioner. Dr. Marcus's hands were firm but soft as they rested on her knee. With a calming whisper, he replied, "If this is too much pressure, let me know." However, the way his gaze lingered on hers conveyed a different message, one that made her heart race. She took a short breath as his fingers rose to barely touch the side of her leg. With a knowing smile on his lips, he muttered, "You're tense. Perhaps I can assist with that." The epitome of poise had always been Dr. Marcus Carter. Every patient felt calmed by his deep, steady voice, white coat that was immaculately ironed, and broad shoulders. He was more than simply Ava's doctor, though. She couldn't help but notice how his smile curled slightly when she spoke, or how his piercing green eyes appeared to linger just a bit too long from their first meeting. For weeks, Ava had been visiting Dr. Foy Carter to treat persistent hip pain following a vehicle accident. Until lately, he had been professional, considerate, and courteous. His touch appeared to linger lately. His inquiries about her health went beyond what was necessary for medical reasons, and the atmosphere in the room became heavier with each visit. Dr. Carter called her one evening after her routine appointment with a proposal. "I've been looking over your progress, and I believe we need to do a more hands-on assessment," he said warmly over the phone. "Ava? Tomorrow after work, are you free? We can take our time because it will be calmer at the clinic." When Ava arrived at the clinic the next evening, her heart was pounding. The main lobby's lights were lowered, and there was none of the normal hum of activity. Her hand hovered just above the handle as she halted at his office door. She inhaled deeply and pushed it open. Dr. Carter was waiting for her, his sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. He smiled warmly, motioning for her to come in. "Thanks for coming," he said, closing the door behind her. The click of the lock was subtle but unmistakable. "Let's start with some stretches," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something more. He guided her to the padded table and helped her lie back, his hands firm yet gentle as he positioned her legs. As he worked, his hands moved expertly over her muscles, kneading away the tension. But as the session progressed, Ava couldn't ignore the way his touch seemed to stray just slightly, his fingers brushing her skin in ways that felt far from clinical. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. "Yes," she whispered, her breath catching as his hands moved higher up her thigh. The tension in the room was palpable. Ava felt her pulse quicken as his hands rested, just for a moment, on her hip. She turned her head to meet his gaze, and what she saw made her heart skip a beat. His eyes were dark, filled with an intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling, "what are we doing?" He didn't move away. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice a husky whisper. "Ava, I've been trying to keep this professional, but—" He paused, his hand brushing against her cheek. "I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath hitched as his words sank in. I don't know if we should," she said, even as her body leaned into his touch. "Tell me to stop," he said, his lips hovering just above hers. "If you want me to stop, I will." But she didn't. Instead, she closed the distance between them, their lips meeting in a kiss that was hesitant at first but quickly deepened. His hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her closer as the weight of their forbidden connection dissolved into pure, unrestrained passion. The sterile walls of the clinic faded into the background as they gave in to the desire that had been simmering between them for weeks. Dr. Carter's hands roamed her body with a mix of tenderness and urgency, every touch igniting a fire within her. Ava's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as their kisses grew more fervent. "Are you sure about this?" he murmured against her lips, his breath hot and uneven. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with anticipation. "I've never been more sure." Time seemed to stand still as they explored the boundaries of their connection, each moment more intense than the last. The examination table, once cold and impersonal, became the stage for their passion as they abandoned all pretense of professionalism. As the night wore on, the intensity between them only grew, but a sudden noise shattered their moment. A faint beeping sound echoed from the corner of the room. Ava froze, her breath catching as she realized it was the clinic's security system. Dr. Carter cursed under his breath, pulling away just enough to glance at the monitor on his desk. His face paled. "Someone's here," he said, his voice laced with panic. Ava scrambled to gather her clothes, her mind racing. What do we do? Before he could answer, the door to his office opened and a security guard stepped inside, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. Dr. Carter? What's going on here? Dr. Carter's jaw tightened as he stood protectively in front of Ava, his shirt still unbuttoned. It's not what it looks like, he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. The guard's gaze flicked between them, his lips curling into a smirk. I won't say anything. For a price. Ava's stomach dropped as she realized the gravity of their situation. This wasn't just a reckless fling anymore, it was a dangerous game with stakes higher than she had ever imagined. Dr. Carter's jaw clenched, his usually composed demeanor replaced by a flicker of panic. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. What do you mean by a price? The guard leaned casually against the doorframe, his smirk widening. Come on, Doc. You and your patient here look cozy. I figure this little secret might cost you your license. Or it might not, depending on how generous you feel. Ava felt her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced at Dr. Carter, whose eyes darkened with barely restrained anger. You're blackmailing me? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. The guard shrugged, clearly unbothered. Call it a business transaction. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, his hand brushing Ava's arm in a subtle gesture of reassurance. Fine, what do you want? The guard's eyes flicked to Ava, his smirk growing. Oh, I'm sure we can come to some sort of arrangement. Ava recoiled at the implication, her stomach churning. You're disgusting, she spat, her voice trembling. Dr. Carter stepped in front of her, his protective instinct kicking in. Don't you dare talk to her like that, he said, his voice sharp. The guard raised his hands in mock surrender. Relax, Doc. I was just kidding. Money works just fine. Let's say $10,000, and I'll forget I ever saw you two. The escalation, Doctor. Carter's jaw clenched, his usually composed demeanor replaced by a flicker of panic. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. What do you mean by a price? The guard leaned casually against the doorframe, his smirk widening. Come on, Doc. You and your patient here look cozy. I figure this little secret might cost you your license. Or it might not, depending on how generous you feel. Ava felt her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced at Dr. Carter, whose eyes darkened with barely restrained anger. You're blackmailing me? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. The guard shrugged, clearly unbothered. Call it a business transaction. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, his hand brushing Ava's arm in a subtle gesture of reassurance. Fine. What do you want? The guard's eyes flicked to Ava, his smirk growing. Oh, I'm sure we can come to some sort of arrangement. Ava recoiled at the implication, her stomach churning. You're disgusting, she spat, her voice trembling. Dr. Carter stepped in front of her, his protective instinct kicking in. Don't you dare talk to her like that, he said, his voice sharp. The guard raised his hands in mock surrender. Relax, Doc. I was just kidding. Money works just fine. Let's say $10,000. And I'll forget I ever saw you two. The deal. The room fell silent, the weight of the guard's demand hanging heavily between them. Ava turned to Dr. Carter, her voice barely a whisper. What are we going to do? He exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the guard. You'll get your money, he said finally, but you'll also be out of a job. I'll make sure of it. The guard chuckled, clearly unimpressed. Sure, Doc. Whatever you say, just have the cash ready by tomorrow. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. Ava sank onto the examination table, her hands trembling. This is a disaster, she muttered. Dr. Carter knelt in front of her, his hands gently cupping her face. Ava, listen to me. I'll handle this. I won't let him hurt you or your reputation. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, trusting him despite the chaos surrounding them. I didn't think it would come to this. Neither did I, he admitted, his voice soft. But I'll fix it. I promise. The next day, Dr. Carter followed through on his promise, arranging to meet the guard in a secluded location with the money. But unknown to the guard, Dr. Carter had also tipped off the clinic's board about an incident involving unethical behavior from security staff. As the guard pocketed the cash, smug satisfaction written all over his face, 2 board members entered the room, accompanied by the clinic director. Their presence was enough to wipe the smirk from his face. What's this? The guard asked, his voice faltering. This is the end of your employment, the director said coldly. We've reviewed security footage of your behavior, and it's clear you're unfit to continue working here. The guard stammered, trying to protest, but it was clear his leverage had crumbled. Dr. Carter watched in silence, his expression unreadable as the guard was escorted out. With the guard gone, Dr. Carter returned to his office, his thoughts heavy. He had protected Ava and salvaged his reputation, but the cost weighed on him. Ava was waiting for him when he arrived, her face a mix of relief and concern. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice tentative. He nodded, sinking into the chair beside her. "It's over, but we can't keep doing this, Ava. It's too dangerous." Her heart sank at his words, but she knew he was right. "I understand," she said softly, "but I don't regret it, not a single moment." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Neither do I, but if this is goodbye, I want you to know you've changed me, Ava, in more ways than I can say." Tears welled in her eyes as she leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "Goodbye, Marcus," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And as she walked out of his office for the last time, both of them knew their connection would linger, even as their lives moved on. The air between them hung heavy with finality as Ava reached the door, her hand trembling on the handle. She turned to glance at Dr. Carter one last time, his head bowed, fingers pressed against his temples in frustration. Her heart ached at the sight, the man who had been her solace now carrying the weight of their choices. But something inside her rebelled against the idea of leaving. Slowly, she stepped back into the room, the door clicking shut behind her. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Ava, what are you?" She silenced him with a bold step forward, her hands resting on his chest. "I'm not walking away," she said, her voice steady, a spark of defiance in her tone. "Not yet." Before he could respond, she tilted her head, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that started softly but quickly deepened. His hesitation melted, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her closer as the fire between them reignited. The stress and chaos of the last 24 hours faded away, replaced by an unrelenting hunger. As they moved together, their lips and hands exploring familiar terrain, Ava's fingers brushed against the edge of his desk. She felt something unusual, a hidden latch beneath the surface. Without breaking their kiss, her curiosity got the better of her, and she flipped it open. The drawer slid out, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a sleek black folder, its contents partially visible, a series of photos, names, and dates. Ava pulled back, her brow furrowing as she grabbed the folder. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. Dr. Carter froze, his expression shifting from passion to alarm. "Ava, it's not what it looks like." She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. The details were meticulous, records of interactions with other patients, similar to their own encounters. Her stomach dropped as she realized she wasn't the first. "You've done this before," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. He reached for her, his voice pleading. "Ava, listen to me. It was nothing like this. You're different." But she couldn't hear him over the sound of her pounding heart. The man she thought she'd shared something special with had a trail of secrets that suggested otherwise. Her anger simmered, but something unexpected surged within her, a desire to reclaim control of the situation. She closed the folder and stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at him. "So, I'm just another one of your patients?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. "No," he insisted, his hands reaching for hers. "Ava, you're more than that, I swear." She let him take her hands, her gaze never leaving his. "Then prove it," she said, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper. "Right here, right now. Show me that I'm not just another name in that folder." His eyes darkened, the tension between them reigniting with a dangerous edge. Without a word, he swept the contents of his desk aside, lifting her onto the smooth surface. His hands gripped her thighs as he pressed himself against her, their connection burning hotter than ever. "You're not just anyone," he murmured against her skin, his voice rough with emotion. "You're everything." Their passion escalated, the sterile office now charged with an intensity that bordered on reckless. Ava's anger mingled with desire, each kiss and touch fueling the fire between them. It wasn't just about pleasure, it was about reclaiming power, proving to herself that she wasn't a pawn in his game. As their breaths slowed and the heat between them began to subside, Ava lay back on the desk, her fingers trailing along his jawline. "Tell me something," she said softly. "If I hadn't found that folder, would you have ever told me?" Dr. Carter hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I would have done anything to keep you in my life." Ava sat up, her eyes locking onto his. "And now?" He reached for her hand, his expression earnest. "Now I'll do whatever it takes to prove you mean more to me than anyone ever has." She smiled faintly, her emotions a whirlwind of doubt, anger, and something dangerously close to affection. "Then you'd better be ready to fight for it, Doctor," she said, slipping off the desk and straightening her clothes. As she reached the door, she glanced back, her eyes sparkling with a mix of mischief and challenge. "Because I'm not done with you yet." With that, she disappeared into the hallway, leaving Dr. Carter standing in the aftermath of their passion. A man who had just lost control of the very game he thought he was playing.